Okay, I'm going to try this again. I just went through a 20-minute lecture and it didn't record the sound. I have no idea why, so I'm going to do it again. Chapter 5, Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis occurs in two stages. You have the light reactions and you have the carbon reactions. Synonyms for the carbon reactions are the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions, and they all occur in this structure here called a chloroplast. Sunlight powers photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the way that plants make their own food by converting sunlight into the food. And they need a few simple ingredients. They need sunlight and the type of light they need. They need carbon dioxide and they need water. Now here is the reaction for photosynthesis. CO2 plus H2O plus light makes glucose, C6H12O6 plus oxygen. Okay? And it works in the reverse when we get to cellular respiration. This is the plant part, this is the animal part. Here is a plant cell. This is the vacuole, and this is a chloroplast. The chloroplast is where photosynthesis actually takes place. This half of the life cycle, okay, sunlight and carbon dioxide make oxygen and plant matter. The animal eats the plant matter and gives off the CO2 and the water that this plant needs to as an input for it to survive. And so it's a complementary system. Okay, you can't have one without the other. Let's talk briefly about wavelengths of light. There is wavelengths that go all the way from gamma rays to radio waves. The wavelength for visual light, the stuff that we can see, runs from about 400 to 750, I think it's megahertz, but don't quote me on that. But you don't need to know that anyways. There are short wavelengths like blues and violets. There are long wavelengths like red. Okay, and all these rays, this is the light spectrum, are sent to us. Now, how do we see light? Well, this is an interesting process. What occurs, you're looking at a red shirt, okay, and we learned as little kids what red was. Okay, so we were taught when you look at this color, it's red. All a color is a pigment that absorbs certain wavelengths and reflects others. So there are pigments that reflect red light. Okay, and so it looks red to us. All right, and we all learn to recognize that pigment when we're little. Now, what happens, you have to understand that light exists as both a wave and a particle. There are light photons. Okay, and this stuff streams to Earth. And when I look at a red shirt, well, how do my eyes see that red shirt? Well, it's pretty simple. Basically, these wavelengths hit the shirt. The pigment on the shirt reflects all of the wavelengths, reflects the red wavelengths or photons and absorbs the others. Now, when I look at that shirt, light wavelengths and photons are bouncing off of it. They enter my eye through my pupil, and the light photons are absorbed in my retina in these little things called cone cells. And when a cone cell absorbs a light photon of a certain type, it sends a little electrical impulse to the brain. Now the brain takes all these electrical impulses that you're seeing and assembles them into a quote end quote picture of what you see. Everything you see is actually just assembled by your brain. It's like a bunch of pixels. Okay? And there's really no way to know. We can both recognize the wavelengths given off by red pigment, but there's no way I can really know that you and I are seeing the same thing. We learned that pigment reflects wavelengths and we call it red. But the way my brain interprets it versus the way your brain interprets it can be very different. Okay, and I don't want to go into too much detail there, but think about that. Have you ever known somebody, I love red, I hate red? Okay, we might not actually be seeing the same thing. Now, we have ultraviolet and infrared radiation. We can't see that, but some animals can. Here's an example. This is a sidewinder rattlesnake, and this is a emerald tree boa. And this little pit right there is a heat sensing pit. It can see and sense things in the infrared spectrum, as are these little lips, the pits in the lips of this boa. Okay? And so what they see at night when they're hunting, looking for rodents or birds or whatever it is they're going to eat, is something like this. There's an infrared image of a mouse, their prey. Okay? And it helps them hunt at night and find the food that they need. Now these guys, again, they can see in this infrared radiation spectrum. We can't see that unless we have special infrared night vision goggles. Then you have certain arachnids. Here's a scorpion. Scorpions see in the ultraviolet spectrum. So when a scorpion looks at another scorpion, that's what he sees. We see this. But if you put a black light on a scorpion, he will glow like that. Okay? And that's how they see each other, because they can actually see in this ultraviolet spectrum. Now, how does this work? Okay, so all the wavelengths of light hit a plant, hit a leaf. And everything but the greens and yellows are absorbed. The greens and yellows are reflected back. That's why plants look green. Okay? So no pigment absorbs the green light in the plant. So, chloroplasts. Here is a chloroplast. We find them, like, for instance, in these leaves. They'll be interspersed in amongst what is called the mesophyll. And there's a plant cell. We talked about those in Chapter 3. And there's a big central vacuole. It has a couple chloroplasts in it. There's a cell wall, and there is a cell membrane, and there's other organelles. There's the nucleus. Okay. And then you have these thylakoid membranes inside of a chloroplast. These are stacks of these, and these membranes are where the actual chemical reactions take place. Now, I'm not going to make you memorize any chemical reactions. We're just going to look at what goes into it and what comes out of it. All right? Chlorophyll, okay, is what allows chloroplasts to do their job. It's a pigment, okay? So it reflects the green lights and some of the yellows, but absorbs all the other ones. Here's its primary structure, and this is what it looks like in 3 dimensions. But these are little stacks of thylakoid membranes, and that's where chemical reactions occur. Okay, so what happens in the chloroplast? It's really quite simple. All right, the chloroplast, let's look at him here, absorbs light, and it uses water that the plant has. And it uses these to make ATP and NADPH. When you see a line like this, that means a series of chemical reactions. So an ADP molecule, because of these chemical reactions, an ADP molecule, that means adenosine diphosphate or 2 phosphates, picks up a 3rd phosphate and becomes ATP. Okay? So this is a series of reactions, and in this series of reactions, an ADP will pick up a 3rd phosphate and become an ATP. And then this little guy, this coenzyme NADP+, will pick up a hydrogen as a result of this series of reactions. Now, when we get to the end of the reactions, we have a waste product. That's oxygen. It comes out of the plant leaves. Okay? Now, the carbon reactions take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It uses the energy molecule, the energy ATP, and the NADPH, which is also a type of energy molecule. And in its series of reactions, it spits out glucose. That's its product. Okay? And glucose is assembled in many different forms, like starch and cellulose, and we'll get to that in just a second. But that is what is going on in these reactions, and that's all you really need to know. And this just basically reiterates what I just said. Here is glucose and cellulose. Cellulose and starch. They all use glucose molecules, but it's how they're bound together. We can't break the bond between glucoses and cellulose. Humans can't. We don't have a way of doing that. To do that, you have to have what is called a rumen, or some kind of cavity that has a bacteria that will break those bonds for us, and then we can use it. We can, however, break the bonds between the molecules in starch. So potatoes, carrots, things like that have starch in them, we can eat that and digest it and get some good. But you can eat grass all day long. It's not going to help you at all. You can't digest it. The only primate that can digest cellulose that I know of is the gorilla. And in their appendix, they have a little symbiotic bacterial colony that helps them break down the cellulose by breaking these bonds. This is an interesting creature. It's called Elysia slug. And basically, this is an animal. It's a slug. It's sort of like a snail without a shell. Okay? And this guy crawls around on reefs close to the sunlight, and it eats algae to get some of its food. All right? But as it eats the algae, all of its gut areas are inundated with little chloroplasts from the algae. It doesn't digest them. And those chloroplasts conduct photosynthesis, making even more food for this big sea slug. Okay? And so this guy can make his own food, or he can eat his own food, and he actually does both. If we look at a electrophoretic or electrophoresis of the DNA of the algae and the slug, we see some very close similarities. Now, what does this have implications for the future? Let's say at some point we start producing so many people we can't feed them all. Well, could we use something like this and try to mimic it in, say, a food animal? Let's say we took a pig or a cow, and we were able to inject algae chloroplasts into their skin or their capillaries close to the skin. And they would generate food from the sunlight for the cattle or the pigs. Okay? Or you could even do this to chickens. All right? And that would allow them, so we wouldn't have to feed them as much food to get them up to adult size for being butchered so that we could eat them. And so it would cost less to produce the meat, and you would need less space and less resources to produce the meat. Okay? Because meat is not the most efficient way to go to produce food. But most people want meat. Okay? We like meat in our diet because we are omnivores. We're not herbivores. We eat both things. You know, we eat meat and vegetables. We have the dentition for it. And so, let's say you have green pigs and green chickens, you could actually have green eggs and ham, because probably the meat and the eggs might be green. But they could always dye that if that was a block for people to eat it. But there you go. Vocab list. This is a list of all the terms we've used in this chapter, and you can look them up, and as long as you know them all, you should be pretty good on this chapter. All right, and there we go. That wraps up vocabulary for this chapter and chapter 5.